The cart moved north from Cordoba in the early morning, when the road was still cool and the light had not yet found its full weight on the Spanish plain. A boy sat among the bundled possessions of his family, watching the landscape slowly change outside the cart's opening, the low hills of Batica giving way to denser country, the familiar shapes of home becoming something he would carry in memory rather than stand inside. His name was Lucius Annaeus Seneca, and he was perhaps 5 years old, and he had no knowledge of what the road north was carrying him toward. No child does. The cart moved, and the boy watched, and the world rearranged itself around him as it would continue to do, for the rest of his long and complicated life, in ways he could neither predict nor refuse. His father, Seneca the Elder, was a man of rhetorical ambitions and provincial achievement, and Rome was where ambition went to be tested. The family arrived in the city sometime in the earliest years of what we now call the 1st century, bringing with them the particular alertness of people who have traveled far to reach a center and intend to make something of the distance they have covered. Young Seneca was educated among the best teachers the city could offer. He studied philosophy under the Stoic Attalus, who spoke about virtue and the sovereignty of the mind with a clarity that the boy found he could not stop returning to. The way one returns to a certain piece of ground because the footing there is better than anywhere else. He studied rhetoric, grammar, mathematics, the full apparatus of a Roman education designed to produce men fit for public life. And he studied with a devotion that was not merely scholarly, but something more, as though the ideas he encountered were not ornaments for a future career, but answers to questions he had been forming in the cart, coming north, questions whose shape he had not yet been able to name. Rome in those years was a city that consumed its inhabitants with a specific and elegant efficiency. The morning salutation, the forum's business, the afternoon client, the dinner invitation that could not be refused, the political obligation that arrived dressed as a social courtesy. A man who wished to matter in Rome found that mattering was a full-time occupation that left little room for the kind of life a philosophy student might think was worth living. Seneca understood this early, and spent the decades that followed in the particular difficulty of a person who sees the trap and cannot quite leave it, because leaving would require surrendering everything the trap was built from, and the man inside it is not entirely sure there is ground to stand on outside. He rose, in the way ambitious men rise in Rome, through positions of increasing visibility. He was questor, an entry into the financial administration of the state. He became known as a writer and orator with a style so singular that later readers would find it unmistakable. The short, stabbing sentence, followed by the long, complex unwinding of its implications, a rhythm that felt like someone thinking out loud with great speed and also great care. He attracted attention in the Senate. He attracted the wrong kind of attention from the Emperor Caligula, who found him brilliant enough to be infuriating, and who reportedly restrained from having him killed only because someone pointed out that he was already ill and would likely not survive long enough to make an execution necessary. Caligula's instinct for the dramatic was thwarted, briefly by the more practical voice of medicine. He survived Caligula. He survived the transition to Claudius. He survived in the way survival can sometimes mean its own form of defeat, his own success, because it was his success, or perhaps some other combination of ambition and enmity and Roman court politics too, tangled to fully untangle, that produced the accusation that sent him into exile on the island of Corsica in the year 41 of the Common Era. The accusation was adultery with Julia Livilla, sister of the dead Emperor Caligula. Whether it was true is one of those questions history does not resolve, so much as set down quietly and leave where it fell. The Emperor Claudius sent him away. The Senate ratified it. And Seneca, who had spent 3 decades learning to matter in Rome, found himself on a small rocky island in the sea, with 8 years in which to discover what remained when the mattering was taken away. Corsica, in the 1st century, was not a place that offered much consolation. The island was remote, the community sparse, the culture at some distance from what a Roman man of letters would have recognized as civilization. Seneca wrote during this period, as he would always write, because writing was the form his thinking took when it needed to become visible. Essays, philosophical letters, consolations addressed to friends still in Rome, who may or may not have been in a position to receive them. He wrote a consolation to his mother Helvia, reassuring her with the full apparatus of Stoic philosophy that his exile was not, in any sense that mattered philosophically, a diminishment of his real life. He wrote a consolation to Polybius, a freedman in the imperial court, in a way that later readers found uncomfortably servile, too eager to please the people who held the key to his return. He wrote, "He walked the rocky coastline in the salt wind. He looked at the sea, which had no interest in his political situation, and went on being the sea regardless." There is something in those 8 years that the biography tends to summarize quickly, as though exile is primarily a transition between 2 more interesting chapters. But 8 years of enforced stillness is a long time to sit with your own mind. It is a long time to watch the habits of thought that formed in Rome, the habits of the politically calculating, the rhetorically strategic, the perpetually forward-angled mind, become visible as habits rather than necessities, because the necessity has been removed. Seneca on Corsica could not attend the morning salutation. He could not manage a client relationship, or position himself for the next appointment, or calibrate his afternoon against someone else's evening. He could only think and write and walk the coast and understand, with the slow certainty of enforced understanding, what he had been doing with his time before this island. He returned to Rome in 49 of the Common Era. Recalled by the influence of Agrippina the Younger, who had ascended to a decisive position in the court of Claudius, and who wanted a tutor for her son. The son was Nero. Seneca was appointed his teacher, and as Nero's influence grew, became his speechwriter and chief advisor during the years immediately following Nero's rise to power in 54. The early years of Nero's reign were, by most accounts, a period of relatively good governance, modest, stable, without the extravagances and violences that would come later, and Seneca was at the center of it, shaping policy and prose in equal measure. He was also accumulating wealth, an enormous fortune, approximately 300 million sesterces by some estimates, which was a sum so large it requires a kind of philosophical patience to hold without judgment. He counseled against greed. He argued for the sovereignty of the philosophical life over the financial life. He did this while being one of the richest men in Rome. This was the kind of contradiction his enemies found useful. Publius Suculus was among the loudest of them. He rose in the Senate to denounce Seneca with the particular relish of a man who has found an argument he knows will draw blood, calling him a hypocrite, a philosopher who preached austerity from a palace, a man whose counsels about time and virtue and the good life were invalidated by the obvious evidence of the life he was actually living. The charge circulated, it still circulates, and Seneca, by his own testimony, did not dismiss it. He sat with it, he turned it over. He wrote about it in letters to his friend Lucilius, with a candor that is either the most sincere document of self-examination in the Latin tradition, or the most sophisticated performance of it, depending on how charitably one reads him. He argued that the Stoic view was not that the wise man must be poor, but that the wise man must not be governed by his wealth, that the question is not what one has, but whether what one has replaced the sovereignty of one's own considered mind over the direction of one's life. He argued this. He kept the money. He kept writing about the philosophical life. And the tension between these facts is one of the things that makes him feel, across the centuries, not like a saint or a sage, but like a man. It was during these years, somewhere around 49, around the period of his return from exile and the beginning of his work in Nero's court. A period of transition and accumulated perspective, and the specific philosophical clarity that follows long enforced withdrawal that Seneca composed the essay known as De Brevitate Vitae, on the shortness of life. He addressed it to a man named Pompeius Paulinus, who was, by most accounts, a senior Roman official concerned with the administration of the grain supply of Rome. This was not an incidental detail. The grain supply was one of the most consuming administrative responsibilities available in the first century, a vast logistical enterprise involving requisitions, distribution, accounting, supply chains running through North Africa and across the Mediterranean, and the kind of bureaucratic pressure that fills every hour with its own necessity, and leaves at the end of the day a man who has been extremely busy and has had no time at all to think about whether the busyness was the right kind. Seneca was writing to someone he knew. He was writing to someone whose days he could imagine with the specificity of a friend. The morning appointments, the afternoon messengers, the evening ledgers, the sense of importance and consequence, and the complete occupation of every available moment. He was writing to someone who was, in the specific language Seneca would use in the essay, one of the occupation. The essay begins with what sounds like a common observation and turns out to be something considerably stranger and more demanding. Most people, Seneca writes, complain that life is short. They say it as though it is a fact about the world, a condition of human existence, something given in the nature of things that a person can note and lament and then continue living around. Seneca's opening move is to say that this is wrong. Not partly wrong, not wrong in emphasis, wrong in the way a diagnosis is wrong when the patient has identified the wrong disease. Life is not short. The problem is something else entirely, and until the something else is correctly identified, no amount of lamenting the brevity of life will produce any change in how a person experiences it. This was not a small thing to claim. The sense of insufficient time is among the oldest and most persistent of human complaints. It runs through Greek lyric poetry, through the wisdom literature of the ancient Near East, through the accounts of dying men in every culture that has left records of its dying. Seneca was arguing not that the complaint was misdirected or overstated, but that it was at its root a misunderstanding. And misunderstandings, in the Stoic account, are the origin of all suffering, because what a person believes about their situation determines how they feel about it, and if the belief is wrong, the suffering it produces is both real and unnecessary, a second injury layered on top of the first. He had reasons for the claim. He had spent 8 years on Corsica, watching time move with a clarity the city had never allowed. He had spent the subsequent years at the center of Roman power, watching men of enormous ability and purpose spend themselves entirely, every hour allocated, every commitment honored, every obligation met, and arrive at the end of days that were by any external measure fully used, and which were by any internal measure that mattered philosophically, largely empty. He had watched the grain prefect rise before dawn. He had watched the senator negotiate his morning. He had watched himself, because he was honest enough for that, and he had seen what he was doing and what it was costing and why. The essay was born from that watching. It was born from Corsica and from Rome and from the specific philosophical tradition he had inherited, which gave him the vocabulary and the structure to say what he had seen in terms that were not merely personal complaint, but argued, testable, philosophical claim. The Stoic tradition gave him this. It had been giving Roman philosophers this for generations, arriving via a lineage that ran from the Greek-speaking schools of Athens and Alexandria through the adaptations of Cicero and Cato, and the Roman thinkers who had worked to translate Greek philosophical rigor into the Latin idiom and the Roman context. Zeno of Citium had established the foundational proposition that virtue is the only genuine good, that everything else, wealth, health, reputation, the grain supply of Rome, is a preferred indifferent, something that may be reasonably sought, but that cannot constitute the substance of a genuinely good life. This proposition, which sounds abstract when stated directly, becomes concrete when applied to time. If the hours of a life are spent in the pursuit of preferred indifference at the expense of the only genuine good, the cultivation of virtue, the exercise of reason, the practice of living in accordance with what a rational mind, honestly applied, identifies as worth doing, then the hours of a life have been spent in the wrong direction, not catastrophically, not beyond recovery, but in the wrong direction in a way that a correct diagnosis might still address. Seneca had internalized this framework so thoroughly that it was no longer something he was applying to his experience. It was the shape his experience took. And de brevitate vitae is the result of that internalization directed outward toward a specific friend, with the urgency of someone who genuinely believes that the argument, understood properly, is an intervention that might change how that friend spends the next morning, the next month, whatever remains of the years still to come. There is nothing distant or academic in the essay's tone. It is addressed to someone by name. It imagines that person's days in detail. It uses the second person with the freedom of long familiarity. It is, in the oldest and most precise sense, a letter, and like all letters worth writing, it is shaped by what the writer knows about the person receiving it, and by what the writer hopes that person will do with what they receive. Among the Stoics whose thinking fed into Seneca's work, there was a long tradition of what they called philosophical counsel, the practice of directing philosophical argument, not at an abstract audience, but at a specific individual in a specific situation with the specific aim of changing how that individual understood their circumstances, and through that changed understanding, changing how they acted in them. Epicurus had written such letters. The Cynic tradition had practiced a version of it. And Seneca inherited this practice and made it his primary literary form, the epistle, the address, the essay, framed as a conversation with someone whose life and circumstances he knew and cared about. De brevitate vitae was the exercise of this tradition toward Pompeius Paulinus, a man whose days were consumed by the grain supply of the city, and who, Seneca believed, was at the risk of spending his life in the sustained and competent management of things that were not the point. The essay would travel beyond Paulinus, of course. It was written to one man and read by Rome, and then by the centuries that followed. Montaigne read it in his Tower Library in the Dordogne in the 16th century, and found in it the central preoccupation of his own essays about how to live. Scholars in monastic scriptoria in the Middle Ages copied it with the care they reserved for texts they believed contained something irreplaceable. It passed through the great disruptions and transmissions of the Western intellectual tradition, arriving in each new era still carrying the specific human urgency of a man writing to a friend, still warm, still particular, still shaped by the knowledge that Paulinus had an early meeting tomorrow and a full afternoon after that, and a desk covered in requisitions that needed answering, and that somewhere in the general necessity of all this managing, the life Paulinus was actually living was moving past without being fully inhabited. What makes De Brevitate Vitae strange and durable is not the philosophical argument alone, though the argument is serious and worth taking seriously on its own terms. What makes it strange is the combination of philosophical rigor and personal address, the way the abstract claim about time and its proper use is made concrete by being aimed at a specific person in a specific situation, with all the warmth and candor and slight impatience of genuine friendship. Seneca was not writing a general treatise, he was writing to Paulinus. He was writing, by extension, to everyone who has ever stood at the end of a long and fully occupied day and felt, beneath the exhaustion of everything accomplished, the ghost of something that was not accomplished, something that cannot be checked off a list because it is not a task, but a quality of attention, the quality of having been genuinely present in the hours that passed, of having inhabited them rather than survived them. That specific human thing, the gap between busyness and presence, between the filled day and the lived one, is what the essay is made of. And Seneca was at the time of its composition in the particular position of a man who had learned this from experience rather than from argument alone. The exile had stripped away the apparatus of the occupied life and left him on a rocky island with nothing but his mind and whatever philosophical resources he had built up over the preceding decades. And those decades of resources had turned out to be sufficient, had turned out, in fact, to be more than he had known he possessed, because the circumstances of their testing had been more severe than anything he had previously been asked to inhabit. He had come back from Corsica, changed in the specific way that enforced withdrawal changes a person who uses it philosophically rather than merely enduring it, with a sharper sense of what the hours are for and what it costs to lose them, to things that are merely urgent rather than genuinely important. The man who sat down to write De Brevitate Vitae was carrying all of this. He was carrying Corsica and Rome and Nero and the rhetorical training and the philosophical tradition and the enormous fortune he could not quite justify and would not quite relinquish, and the specific daily reality of Pompeius Paulinus rising before dawn to manage the grain that fed the city, too busy to read a letter from a friend that was sitting perhaps in a drawer of his desk, waiting for a moment of leisure that never quite arrived. Seneca put all of this into the essay. He did not resolve his own contradictions in writing it. The philosopher with the fortune, the counselor of austerity, who lived in abundance, the adviser on the proper use of time, who spent his mornings in Nero's court. He wrote through the contradictions with the honesty that is the best thing philosophy can offer when it cannot produce clarity, an unflinching account of what one has seen and what one believes, held alongside an equally unflinching acknowledgement of the distance between the belief and the life being lived. In the late 1st century, in a city that ran on obligation and social debt and the continuous management of other people's needs and expectations, this kind of honesty was not common. That was not comfortable. It was not the kind of thing that helped a man's political position or made his dinner invitations easier to receive or decline. It was the kind of thing that a man wrote when he had been to Corsica and come back changed, when the years on the rocky coast had given him a perspective from which Rome's perpetual motion looked, for the first time, like what it actually was, a very large and very sophisticated system, for ensuring that the hours of a life were used for everything except what they were for. The lamp in Seneca's study, in the pre-dawn quiet of whatever room he composed in, would have been steady, the city not yet awake, the street noise not yet risen, the appointments and obligations of the day still an hour or two away from demanding entry. In that interval, in that small window of time before Rome started up again with all its magnificent and consuming machinery, he wrote sentences about time that would outlast the city he was writing them in, sentences that would arrive in other lamps, in other pre-dawn hours, in other rooms where someone sat with the day not yet begun, and a thought about what to do with it, forming in the quiet before everything else began. He wrote to Paulinus, he wrote through Paulinus. He wrote with the specific candor of someone who has been given 8 years to think and has not wasted them, what he believed the hours were for. The essay was sent, it was read, perhaps, by Paulinus, perhaps set down quickly and returned to, perhaps carried home at the end of a long administrative day, and opened in the evening when the requisitions were finished and the grain supply of Rome was for this night provisioned. Perhaps Paulinus read it all the way through. Perhaps he read it in pieces, a paragraph at a time, in whatever small intervals a man of his position could find. What he made of it is something history does not record. What history records is the essay itself which went on traveling after both men were gone, carrying across the centuries the specific temperature of its composition, the urgency of someone writing to a friend he is genuinely concerned about, the philosophical seriousness of a man who has thought carefully about something true and believes that sharing it clearly is the most useful thing he can do with the time available to him, and the warmth, unmistakable even across 2,000 years of transmission, of a letter that was always meant to arrive somewhere, in some evening, in some hour, when the day's work was done, and the question of what to do with one's remaining time was still, as it always is, quietly open. That essay is here now, not as a relic or an artifact or a demonstration of ancient wisdom, as the thing it always was, a letter in transit, still warm from the hand that wrote it, still carrying the original and unrepeatable urgency of a man writing at a lamp while the city sleeps, addressing a friend by name, arguing with everything he has that the hours of a life are worth more than this, worth more than the grain supply and the morning appointments and the full and empty days, worth something that can only be recovered in the moment one stops, sets down what one was carrying, and considers honestly and without hurry what the hours are actually for. Seneca pressed the reed to the papyrus in the early morning quiet of his study, and the first sentence arrived not as an argument, but as a correction, a gentle one, the kind a patient man offers to a friend who has been repeating the same complaint for years without noticing that the complaint itself is the problem. The sentence said roughly that life is not short, and it paused there in the way that all serious sentences pause before they deliver the thing they have been building toward. Life is not short, and then, after the pause, the rest of it, we make it short. That was the whole argument, in its seed. Everything that followed, the pages of illustration and example, the portraits of wasted lives, the comparisons to men who had lived long and well, the counsel directed at Paulinus and through him at every person who would later read the essay, all of it grew from that single inversion, not a lament about the brevity of life, not a resignation to the limits of what nature allows, a challenge placed quietly on the desk of anyone who picked it up. The problem is not outside. The problem is in the manner of living itself. The morning when Seneca wrote those words was probably not exceptional. The city below his study was beginning its noise, as it always did, well before the sun had made its full appearance. Carts that were forbidden from entering Rome during daylight hours were completing their final runs before the ban took effect, their wheels loud on the stone. Slaves were moving through corridors with water and bread. Somewhere a dog was barking at the particular quality of early light that always seems to startle dogs. And at a table in a room set apart from all of this, a man was constructing an argument that would still be read 2,000 years later, in rooms he could not have imagined. By people in conditions of comfort and exhaustion, he had no framework to picture. What he wrote was not abstract. That matters. Seneca was not a philosopher who retreated into systems. He was a philosopher who addressed people, specific ones, by name in circumstances he understood, because he had spent years close enough to power to know exactly what the occupation of a powerful life looked and felt like from the inside. The essay was written to Pompeius Paulinus, a man of administrative rank who spent his days managing the grain supply of Rome. The grain supply of Rome was not a small responsibility. It was, in the most literal sense, the thing that stood between the city and hunger, between political stability and riot. Paulinus was not lazy. He was not unserious. He was exactly the kind of man Seneca knew best, genuinely capable, genuinely occupied, and genuinely, systematically, unable to find the hours to live the life that his capabilities might otherwise have made possible. The argument Seneca offered him was not a rebuke. It was a kind of philosophical gift. Or perhaps more precisely, it was the thing that a gift arrives wrapped in, the outer layer that must be removed before the actual thing inside can be seen. And the outer layer was this: the assumption that we are living inside a scarcity has to be examined before it can be corrected. Not argued away, but genuinely looked at, turned over in the morning light, held up against the actual facts of a day. The actual facts of a day are not what most people think they are. Seneca had sat with this for years, long enough to notice that the people around him who claimed to have no time were, when examined carefully, not suffering from a deficit of hours, but from a particular relationship to those hours, a relationship of inattention, of reflex, of allowing whatever was loudest to determine where the mind went next. He had watched men of considerable intelligence and good intention move through entire weeks of their lives as though walking through a corridor in the dark, reaching the end, and looking back and finding very little they could name, not because nothing had happened, quite the opposite. Enormous amounts had happened. Meetings had been attended, decisions had been rendered, letters had been written and received and replied to, obligations had been met with something that looked, from the outside, exactly like efficiency. And yet at the end of the week, when the question was put plainly, not as an accusation, but as a genuine inquiry, the honest answer was that very little of it had been genuinely lived. This is the distinction the essay turned on. Seneca was careful about it. He was a man trained in rhetoric, which meant he was a man trained to know where the weight of an argument had to be placed, and he placed it here, on this word, vivere, to live, not to exist, not to persist, not to move through the available days collecting obligations and discharging them. To live. He meant something specific by this, something that had to do with presence, with the quality of attention brought to a given hour, with whether a person was the author of their time or merely the bystander to it. The difference, once noticed, is extremely difficult to unnotice. A Roman official could move through an entire afternoon of appointments, petitioners arriving in sequence, a scribe recording decisions, messengers leaving, and returning with replies. The administrative machinery of a large city running through him the way water runs through a channel, and reached the evening having occupied every hour and inhabited none of them. The day gone, in his wake, like water poured onto dry stone. He would be tired. He would have accomplished things. He might even have accomplished them well. But when the lamp was lit and the last petitioner had gone and the room was quiet, there would be something in that room that was not quite satisfaction and not quite emptiness, but something in between, a kind of transparency to the day that had just passed, as though it had happened to someone who shared his body, but was not, in the strictest sense, him. Seneca had a way of making this visible through comparison. It was one of his most characteristic rhetorical moves, placing two things side by side that people never thought to compare, and letting the comparison do its work without forcing a conclusion. The comparison here was between the way a person treats their money and the way the same person treats their time. A man of property in first-century Rome guarded that property with considerable care. He employed gatekeepers. He maintained walls. He engaged the legal structures of the city to defend his boundaries against encroachment, against theft, against any of the numerous ways that wealth could be diminished without the owner's consent. If someone arrived at his door and announced that they intended to take 3 acres of his estate, the response would have been immediate and vigorous. The courts would have been involved. Senators would have been consulted. Every instrument of Roman civic life available to a man of means would have been brought to bear on the protection of what was his. And yet the same man, on the same afternoon, would allow a visitor to spend 3 hours of his time on flattery and small talk, and the kind of conversation that leaves no impression whatsoever on either party would hand those hours over without a thought, as though they had been worth nothing at all. Would do this not occasionally, but as a matter of routine, would do it without noticing, because the culture around him had made it entirely normal, even virtuous, to be thus available to the demands of others. The estate was defended with walls and dogs and lawyers. The hours evaporated like morning moisture off the stone. What Seneca wanted Paulinese, and through Paulinese anyone to feel, was the precise strangeness of this, not to feel guilty about it. Guilt, in his view, was not a philosophically useful instrument here. It was too reactive, too focused on the past as a source of reproach, rather than the present as a site of possibility. What he wanted instead was something more like the mild, clarifying vertigo that comes from noticing that what has been treated as nothing is in fact the most valuable thing one possesses. Time, Seneca argued, is the only possession that genuinely cannot be recovered, replaced, or supplemented. Money lost can be re-earned, given sufficient effort and circumstance. Reputation damaged can, sometimes, be rebuilt. Health reduced can, in many cases, be restored. But an hour that has passed into what he called the completed past is past completely and permanently. It belongs, once lived, to a category of things that are beyond all alteration. If it was lived well, it is there, secured in the unchangeable. If it was allowed to slip away without genuine inhabitation, it is also there, but as absence rather than presence, as the outline of something that might have been and was not. This is not a small observation. It has the quality of something that can be acknowledged quickly and nodded past, the way one nods past a landmark seen many times on a familiar road. Yes, yes, time passes. Time is irreplaceable. One should use it well. The acknowledgement complete, the attention moves on. But Seneca was interested in what happened when the acknowledgement refused to be nodded past, when it was held instead and turned over and allowed to land with its actual weight. Think, he invited, and this was not a rhetorical exercise, but an honest imaginative one, of collecting every hour you have allowed to drift away in the past year. Not the hours of illness or genuine necessary rest, not the hours given to genuine love or genuine work or the kind of conversation that actually leaves the participants different from how they entered it. Just the hours that went to nothing, to the waiting room of consciousness, to being present in body and absent in attention. Imagine gathering those hours from wherever they dispersed and placing them in a single room. The room, Seneca suggested, would be enormous, and standing in it, a person would barely recognize the time as having belonged to them, because in the most genuine sense, it had not. It had been theirs in name only. They had held it without holding it, let it pass without passing through it. The room he imagined was not a horror. That is important. Seneca was not building toward dread. He was building toward a particular quality of seeing, the seeing that precedes and makes possible a different kind of choosing. The room full of unlived hours was not a punishment, but an invitation. If these hours were lost, then other hours, hours not yet arrived, could be found instead. The account was not closed. That is precisely what made the argument philosophical rather than elegiac. The perpetually busy occupy a special place in Seneca's attention. He had a word for them, the occupati, and the word deserves to be heard clearly before it is analyzed, because it is one of those Latin words that carries more than translation can hold. The occupied, the ones whose time is taken up, the ones whose hours are spoken for. There is something in the word that implies not violence, but something more pervasive than violence, a condition so normal that it does not announce itself as a condition at all, but simply as life. Seneca saw the occupati clearly, because he was one of them. He wrote about them with the precision of someone working from the inside, rather than observing from a comfortable distance. The occupati were not failures of will or character in any simple sense. They were in many cases people of genuine competence and genuine commitment, people who could point to accomplishment after accomplishment, and who could account for their hours in terms of external results. What they could not do was account for their hours in terms of genuine presence, because the mechanism of busyness had a tendency, Seneca noticed, to run independently of the person who was ostensibly doing it, to generate its own momentum, its own urgency, its own self-justifying structures, until the person inside the busyness had become something more like a component of the system than its sovereign. This was the insight that Seneca found most worth pressing on. Not that the busy were lazy, quite the opposite. Not that they were incapable, clearly false, but that busyness, at a certain pitch and continuity, becomes a form of flight. Not a deliberate flight, not a flight chosen in full consciousness, a flight from the particular quality of stillness in which honest self-examination becomes possible. As long as there is something to be done, something that must be done, something that cannot wait, the moment of honest examination can always be deferred, and the deferral, practiced long enough, stops feeling like deferral and starts feeling like simply the way life is. Seneca had watched men spend entire careers in this deferral, had watched them fill every available hour with what looked from the outside like purpose, and had known because he was attentive enough to see it, that the purpose was in part a shield, not a dishonest shield, not a cynical one, a shield that its bearer had come to believe in completely. The work was real, the obligations were genuine, the demands were pressing, all of this was true. And underneath all of this truth, something else was also true. The man who is always occupied never has to face the question of what he would be without the occupation. He never has to sit in the room of himself without furniture. Seneca sat in that room for 8 years. He had not chosen it. The exile on Corsica, the enforced stillness of a man stripped of his position and his audience, and the particular importance that comes from proximity to power. This was not a philosophical retreat voluntarily undertaken. It was imposed. And in the first years of it, he likely experienced it as a man experiences any acute diminishment, with grief, with anger, with the specific indignity of having one's time given back to oneself without ceremony or consent. But something happened in that stillness, something that Seneca would spend the rest of his life trying to describe from various angles in various letters, through various examples drawn from his reading of Stoic and Epicurean philosophy alike. What happened was a reacquaintance, not a dramatic one, gradual, like light returning after a long cloud, a reacquaintance with the shape of his own mind when it was not in the service of anything external, with the quality of an afternoon that was simply an afternoon, requiring nothing, performing for no one, belonging entirely to the person who inhabited it. He came back from Corsica with the argument of de brevitate voite, already half formed by lived experience. The essay was, in a sense, the written version of what 8 years of enforced philosophical leisure had taught him about the difference between the life that looks full and the life that actually is. A man who had been given back his hours against his will, and had learned slowly, honestly, not without resistance, that what had been taken from him was not his life, but only his position, and that his life had been there all along, waiting patiently in the hours he had never quite managed to inhabit. The essay makes a distinction that lives quietly at the center of everything else it argues. The distinction is between a life measured in years and a life measured in what was done with those years at the level of genuine experience. Two men of exactly equal biological years could die on the same afternoon in Rome and have lived, in Seneca's terms, vastly different quantities of life. The one who had moved through his years with consciousness and deliberate choice, who had read carefully, thought honestly, cultivated genuine friendships rather than useful contacts, devoted some portion of every day to what mattered to him rather than only to what was demanded of him. This man died at the end of something that could fairly be called a long life, regardless of the number of years it contained. The other, who had passed through the same span of calendar time as though asleep, moving from one urgent occupation to the next, without pausing to inhabit any of them, never quite present in any room he was in, always oriented toward the next task, the next obligation, the next crisis that required his attention. This man's death was not the end of a life, but the interruption of a long postponement. He had been meaning to live. The circumstances had never quite been right. There had always been something that needed doing first. And now there was no more first. This is Seneca's most demanding observation, and he makes it without apology, though also without cruelty. He does not want to frighten. He wants to clarify. He wants to clarify. The distinction between these two deaths is not a moral verdict, but a philosophical observation about what a life consists in. And the observation is most useful not at the end, not as a last assessment, but at the beginning, or better, now. In whatever morning or afternoon or late evening the essay arrives into, across whatever distance of time separates its writing from its reading, the specific quality of a day inhabited with genuine philosophical intentionality, with attention brought fully to each hour, with choices made from considered value rather than ambient obligation, This, Seneca argued, is a different thing in kind, not merely in degree, from a decade of distracted busyness. A decade of distracted busyness is, in his account, not 10 years, but something closer to a single extended moment of inattention. It has quantity, but not depth. The opposite, a single day, genuinely inhabited, contains more of what actually makes a life than the decade could hold. This is a qualitative claim about time, not a quantitative one, and qualitative claims about time are harder to make than quantitative ones because we have centuries of language built around counting, counting years, counting achievements, counting the accumulated evidence of a life well occupied, and very little language built around the things Seneca was pointing at. The feeling of an hour that was genuinely yours, the specific texture of a morning in which you were present in yourself rather than occupied by the machinery of obligation, the way a single genuine conversation entered with full attention can leave a deeper mark than a month of efficient and forgettable transactions. Most of us know this from the inside. Seneca was not describing a foreign experience. He was describing an experience so familiar that it is almost invisible because the things that are most familiar to us are often the hardest to see, being too close to the eye for ordinary focus. The argument of de brevitate vitae is not a set of instructions. It is more like a pair of glasses held up to the experience of a life already being lived. It sharpens something that was always there but had been slightly blurry, the difference between moving through hours and actually meeting them. Seneca wrote this argument with a reed and papyrus in a room in Rome. He pressed the words into the material in front of him with the particular attention of a man who knew his time was genuinely limited, not in the philosophical sense, but in the practical and political one, because living close to Nero was a form of proximity to danger that required no philosophical elaboration to understand. He addressed the essay to a friend who was probably too busy to read it promptly. He made his argument as clearly and as humanly as he could. He knew the argument would outlast the particular urgency that had produced it. And then he put down the pen. There is something in that gesture, the pen set aside, the argument complete, the essay now existing outside the man who made it, and available to whoever would next pick it up, that carries more philosophical weight than any single sentence in the text. Because the argument of de brevitate vitae is not finally about how to think about time, it is about how to be inside it. And the moment the argument is finished, when the composing is done, and the pressing urgency of making the case has fulfilled itself, and there is nothing left to do, what remains is exactly what the essay was arguing for. The quiet of an hour that has been inhabited completely, that has given everything it had, and now rests in the completed past where it cannot be diminished, or taken back, or revised. Seneca wrote in one of his letters, not this essay, but the correspondence with Lucilius that occupied his last years, that the best kind of ownership is the ownership of what has already happened. The future is uncertain, and the present is brief, but the past is permanent. What has been genuinely lived cannot be taken away. This is not consolation in the soft sense. It is a hard philosophical observation about the structure of time. Whatever has been truly inhabited, whatever has been genuinely present, becomes once completed, immune to fortune. No shipwreck touches it. No political reversal diminishes it. No change in circumstance can reach back into the treasury of what was actually experienced and remove a single coin. The man who has lived, genuinely lived in Seneca's sense, carries an accumulation of secured time that no external force can audit. The hours are not a record kept somewhere that can be seized or burned. They are in a sense that is difficult to express in ordinary language, the person themselves. They are what a life consists in when you remove from it all the things that might be taken away and look at what remains. The occupati cannot say this. They have moved through time without securing it. Their hours are behind them, but not in this sense theirs. They look back and see a long corridor of obligation efficiently traversed, and the corridor is real, the traversal was real, but the genuine ownership of those hours, the specific quality of having met them, of having been present to them with full human attention, that is not there to be found. It is as though the estate was managed perfectly by an administrator who kept meticulous records, but was never quite the person the land belonged to. The clarity of this observation sits in the essay without demanding anything. That is its particular quality. It makes a large claim that most people are not living their lives, and then does not reach for the reader with urgency. It simply places the claim in the room and allows the space around it to do what space does. The claim is either true or it is not. If it is true, each person reading it will have a private way of knowing, one that requires no external verification, because the evidence is entirely internal and entirely available. No one else needs to confirm whether in the last week of one's life there were hours genuinely inhabited or merely passed through. The person who spent them knows. The essay arrived then, in the first century of the Common Era, addressed to a specific man who may or may not have been changed by it, in a world of grain requisitions and imperial proximity and the particular social machinery of Rome at its most elaborate. And the essay arrives now, in whatever evening this is, carrying the same argument without revision, because the argument is not about Rome. It was never really about Rome. It was about the structure of a day, and what it means to live inside one, and whether the life being lived is actually, in the most serious sense, being lived at all. The words Seneca wrote in the early morning quiet, the reed on the papyrus, the lamp steady, the city not yet fully awake, have been making their way through centuries without hurrying. They have passed through manuscript copies and printed editions and translations into languages Seneca could not have imagined spoken by people in circumstances he had no framework to picture. They have arrived on night tables and in bag pockets and on the illuminated surfaces of devices that would have appeared, to a man of the first century, to be purely miraculous, and in each of these arrivals the argument has been exactly the same. Life is not short. The sentence pauses. It waits for what is coming, because it has always known what is coming. It is made short by the manner in which it is lived. And here, in the quiet of this particular evening, the argument arrives without urgency and asks nothing except the thing that all serious arguments eventually ask: genuine attention. Not the attention of someone trying to remember what they have been told. Not the attention of someone taking notes. Just the simple, uncrowded attention of a person who, for this moment, has set down whatever they were carrying. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, but simply the way one sets down a heavy bag at the end of a long walk. When the walk is done, and the destination is here, and there is nowhere else to be. The bag sits on the ground, the hands are light, the shoulders, which had forgotten what they felt like without weight, remember now, and the particular quiet that arrives in that moment of setting down, that quiet that is not emptiness, but the absence of unnecessary carrying. That is where the argument was trying to bring its reader all along. Zeno arrived in Athens with nothing. The ship that had carried him from Phoenicia went down off the Athenian coast, and with it went his cargo of purple dye, the commodity that had made his family prosperous and given his journey its practical reason. He was somewhere near 30 years old. He walked into the city as a man whose itinerary had dissolved, whose purpose had been swallowed by the sea, and whose next step was genuinely unknown. The ancient sources record that he wandered into a bookseller's stall and heard someone reading aloud from the memorabilia of Xenophon, a book about Socrates, about a man who had spent his life asking questions in public and been executed for it. Zeno listened. When the reading was finished, he asked where he might find men like that. The bookseller pointed to the street and said, "Follow that man." The man he pointed to was the cynic philosopher Crates, already well along in his own unconventional life. Zeno followed him. What happened next across the following decades was not a dramatic conversion, but something quieter and more durable. Zeno studied, disputed, listened, thought. He sat with the Megarians and their logical puzzles. He found his way through the Academy's inheritance of Plato. He arrived, by the slow, patient method of someone who had lost his cargo and had therefore nothing to protect, at a set of ideas that felt to him not like a doctrine to be accepted, but like a ground to stand on. He began to teach from a painted porch, a stoa poikile, in the northwest corner of the Athenian agora, speaking to whoever came about virtue and reason and the only kind of freedom that could not be taken by shipwreck or circumstance or the indifference of emperors. The school that formed around him took its name from the porch he taught beneath. Stoic. The word comes from nothing more than architecture, a covered walkway open to the street where commerce and argument conducted themselves in the same afternoon air. There is something fitting in this. The philosophy that would eventually reach Rome and be read in private studies by senators and exiles was, in its origin, public property, open to anyone who happened to walk past. No walls around it, no tuition required, no entrance examination, except the willingness to stop and think. What Zeno taught was simple in outline only. Virtue is the only genuine good. Everything else, health, wealth, reputation, favorable weather, political success, long life, belongs to a different category. These things are preferred when they arrive, and their absence is not welcomed. But they are not goods in the deepest sense, because they can all be taken away by forces outside a person's sovereignty. Virtue cannot be taken. Rational self-governance cannot be removed by a shipwreck or a decree. The capacity to meet whatever arrives with steadiness and clear judgment, this alone is fully one's own, and therefore this alone constitutes the ground of a genuinely flourishing life. This was not, when Zeno taught it, a counsel of passivity or resignation. The Stoics were not indifferent to the world. Many of them moved through it with great energy, holding office, writing, arguing, governing. What distinguished them was not withdrawal, but the specific interior quality they brought to engagement, the refusal to place the weight of their well-being on outcomes they could not control. A person who has genuinely absorbed this does not stop trying. They stop needing things to go a particular way in order to remain themselves. Around time, specifically, this framework generated a set of ideas that would prove more durable than almost anything else in the Stoic inheritance. Time is the medium through which all other goods and losses move. Fortune distributes and withdraws its gifts in time. The body ages in time. Fame accrues and dissolves in time, but the quality of one's attention in this hour, the honesty with which this moment is inhabited, the care with which this thought is followed, this exists in a different relationship to time entirely. It cannot be accumulated or squandered in the ordinary sense. It is either present or absent, and its presence or absence depends entirely on the one thing that fortune cannot touch. 3 centuries later, a man in Rome sat with all of this. Chrysippus of Soli, came after Zeno and made the philosophy harder to ignore, which is perhaps the right way to say what he did. He was not its originator, but he was, in a particular and almost incomprehensible way, its systematizer. The ancient sources claim he wrote more than 700 works, a number so large it becomes almost abstract, like a distance too great to walk. None of them survive in their original form. What survived were fragments, summaries, references in the works of later philosophers who argued against him, reconstructions from quotations. And yet the architecture he built, the logical scaffolding holding together Stoic ethics, physics, and epistemology, is visible in everything that followed. The way the bones of a building remain visible long after the plaster is gone. Chrysippus worked on the question of time with the specific patience of someone who understood that philosophy's usefulness to a human life depends on its getting the foundational questions right. Time, he argued, is not simply the medium through which things happen. It has structure. The past is fixed, complete, immune to revision, held in a condition nothing can alter. The present is the only point of genuine contact with reality, the moving threshold where experience actually occurs. The future is open, not yet determined, not yet available, not yet ours to inhabit. This threefold structure placed different demands on a rational person. The past deserved honest examination without guilt's paralysis. The present deserved full engagement, without distraction by either regret or anticipation. The future deserved reasonable provision without anxious preoccupation. What this meant practically was not obvious until later philosophers worked it through, but the seed was there in the structure. The only moment in which virtue can actually be exercised is the present one. The only moment in which genuine living can occur is the present one. The past, however well or poorly inhabited, is already secured in its completion. The future, however carefully considered, will only become available moment by moment as it arrives. Everything that matters, then, happens in a span of experience so brief that any attempt to escape it into past or future is in the most precise sense a waste of the only ground one actually stands on. By the time these ideas reached Rome, they had passed through several generations of hands and considerable philosophical refinement. The Romans who received them were not, in general, inclined toward philosophical abstraction for its own sake. Roman intellectual culture had a strong practical orientation. Philosophy was expected to illuminate conduct, to address real problems of governance and character, to be useful to a person living an actual life in an actual city with actual obligations. This demand, rather than diminishing the Stoic inheritance, gave it a particular sharpness. The question was no longer primarily, what is virtue in an abstract sense, but how does a person live virtuously, under pressure, in public, surrounded by the competing claims of ambition and loyalty and duty, and the permanent temptation to arrange one's hours around what other people value, rather than what one has thought most carefully about oneself. It was in this Roman version of Stoicism, practical, rhetorical, addressed to specific people, in specific situations, that the question of time found its most urgent home. Seneca read the Greeks. He read Chrysippus, or what was available of him, and he read Posidonius, and he read the Stoic texts that circulated in educated Roman households as the philosophical currency of serious self-examination. But what he added, what made his treatment of the time question something different from what his Greek predecessors had done, was the direct address to a life actually being lived, with all its contradictions intact, with no pretense that philosophy resolved the tension between its principles and the world in which those principles had to operate. There is a sentence Seneca wrote in his letters to his friend Lucilius that was copied more than almost anything else he produced. It reads, "In the Latin he set down, omnia Lucilii aliena sunt, tempus tantum nostrum, estimated all things, Lucilius, belong to others. Time alone is ours." The sentence arrived in a letter, not a treatise. It was written to a specific person in the middle of an ongoing correspondence, as one thought among many. But the sentence has a quality that certain well-made things have, the quality of having been worked until only the essential remains, until no word can be added or removed without loss. It does not argue, it simply states, and in the stating, something that any person in any century can recognize as true becomes audible. What Seneca was drawing on in that sentence was the full weight of the Stoic account of value. The things that belong to others are the things that can be given and taken: money, property, health, status, the favorable opinion of people whose opinion shifts with the wind. These arrive in a life by grace or circumstance or effort, and they depart by the same means. To build one's sense of security on them is to build on a shore that the tide will reach. The Stoics did not say these things were worthless. They said they were not fully one's own, and that to treat them as if they were was the specific confusion that made most human lives anxious, grasping, and ultimately disappointed. Time is different because its passage through a life is not contingent in the same way. It arrives whether one is ready or not, and what one does with it, the quality of attention brought to it, the degree of genuine presence inhabited within it. This belongs entirely to the person living it. No emperor can take that. No shipwreck can remove it. No reversal of fortune can retroactively alter what was genuinely experienced in an hour that has already been lived with full consciousness and care. The practice of memento mori entered the Stoic tradition not as a morbid exercise, but as a specific philosophical technology with a precise function. The phrase itself, "remember that you will die," is older than Stoicism, connected in Roman culture to the custom of having a slave whisper it to a general riding in triumph through the city, a reminder that the glory of the moment was not the permanent condition of the man enjoying it. The Stoics took this cultural practice and gave it philosophical depth. To hold the fact of one's mortality with steady attention, they argued, was not to court despair. It was to dissolve the false urgency of trivial concerns by placing them against the only horizon that never moves. Consider what happens to the irritations and anxieties of an ordinary day when they are held briefly against the fact of death, the slight from a colleague, the delayed response to a letter, the arrangement that did not go as planned. These concerns, which can occupy enormous amounts of interior space, when approached directly, shrink to something closer to their actual size when placed beside the awareness that the person experiencing them has a finite number of days remaining, most of which will not be devoted to resolving small irritations. This is not cynicism, it is calibration. The Stoics thought that calibrated awareness of mortality was not something to perform once and set aside, but a daily practice, a kind of morning orientation toward what actually mattered, renewed each day before the day's concerns could crowd it out. Seneca returned to this practice throughout his letters with the attention of someone who had genuinely tested it. He had had occasion to test it. 8 years of exile on a rocky island with limited resources and no political standing had given him the conditions under which philosophical principles either prove themselves or are quietly abandoned. He had written during that exile essays and consolations sent out to the world he had been removed from, and in the writing, The relationship between theoretical Stoicism and the actual texture of a diminished, contracted life had become real to him in a way that no amount of philosophical reading could substitute for. When he wrote later about mortality as clarifying rather than terrifying, about the shrinking of a life's circumstances as an opportunity rather than a pure loss, he was writing as someone who had inhabited that position and found the philosophy adequate to it. This is part of what the Stoic account of indifference to externals actually means, experienced from the inside rather than described from the outside. It does not mean the external things cease to matter. Seneca missed Rome during his exile. He was aware of the contrast between what his life had been and what it had become. The philosophy did not pretend that this contrast was nothing. What it offered instead was a distinction between the part of him that experienced the loss and could observe it honestly, and a deeper part that the loss could not reach, the part that continued to think, to write, to hold the present moment with whatever quality of attention it deserved. That the external circumstances were drastically reduced did not alter the fact that this deeper capacity remained. And in that remaining, the central Stoic claim about what is genuinely one's own proved itself not as an abstract doctrine, but as a lived discovery. The adiaphora, the indifferent things, the preferred and dispreferred conditions that Zeno had identified at the school's founding, were not, in this discovery, simply dismissed. They remained preferred when available. A comfortable room is preferable to a cold one. Health is preferable to illness. The company of people one loves is preferable to enforced solitude. The Stoics were not pretending otherwise. What they were arguing, and what the period of exile allowed Seneca to verify, was that none of these preferences, however reasonable, constituted the core of a life. The core was something else, something that remained when the preferred conditions were removed, and the question of how much of one's time and attention was organized around that core versus organized around the scramble to secure and maintain preferred conditions was, for Seneca, the central question of how to live. Applied to time, this argument takes on its most specific form. The fear of running out of time is itself a species of the same attachment to an external that produces all the other Stoic anxieties. One cannot control how much time is given. The span of a life is not in one's hands. What is in one's hands fully, completely, without exception, is the quality of presence brought to whatever span arrives. To spend the hours worrying about the hours is not only philosophically confused, but practically self-defeating. It takes the very resource whose loss is feared and burns it in the act of fearing. Anxious dread about the shortness of life is a second theft layered on top of the first. The first theft was whatever caused the distraction. The second is the dread about all the distracted hours, which is itself another form of distraction, and so the cycle sustains itself. The Stoic counsel was not cheerful in the way that certain later formulations of it became. It was clear-eyed. It did not promise that the practice of holding time carefully would make life feel longer in a simple, pleasant way. It promised something more austere and more durable, that the hours genuinely inhabited were qualitatively different from the hours merely passed through, and that the accumulated difference, lived forward through years of philosophical attention, constituted the only form of richness that mortality could not eventually revoke. Whatever has been fully experienced becomes, in Seneca's formulation, permanently secured. The past, once genuinely lived, is held in a condition more stable than any property or investment or accumulated honor. Fortune cannot reach it. It has already happened. It is done and real, and one's own in a way that the feared future can never be. The image Chrysippus left behind, that structure of past, present, and future, each making its proper demand, finds its most human articulation in what Seneca made of it. The past for Seneca was not simply gone, it was the treasury of what had actually been experienced, held permanently against every loss the future might bring. A person who had spent their years genuinely present to what they were doing, who had inhabited their friendships, their study, their work, their pleasures with actual consciousness rather than distracted half attention, had accumulated something no creditor could claim and no exile could remove. This was not a consolation he invented to manage the difficulty of his situation. It was an argument about the structure of time itself, and about where, within that structure, the genuinely permanent things could be found. In the early hours of a Roman morning, before the streets had fully woken, a Stoic practitioner would sometimes spend a few minutes in a particular kind of attention, not meditation in the later sense, not the formal cultivation of a particular mental state, but something more like honest orientation. The day ahead was considered, what might go well, what might go badly, what demands would arrive, what temptations would present themselves, not anxiously, not as a project of anticipatory control, but as the preparation of a craftsman who checks their tools before beginning work. This practice, which Seneca describes and recommends, belonged to a broader architecture of daily attention that included the evening review, holding the day's hours honestly before sleep, and assessing them without punishment, but also without pretense. The evening review is, in the Stoic tradition, one of the practices that closes the loop between philosophical intention and actual behavior. It is not enough, the Stoics argued, to believe in living with full attention and then organize one's days as though the belief required no maintenance. Philosophy was not a conviction held somewhere in the background while the foreground was occupied with everything else. It was a discipline, practiced daily, in specific moments through specific habits of mind. The evening review was one of these moments. Sitting with the day's hours honestly, not at the level of whether tasks were completed or meetings went as planned, but at the level of whether one had actually been present, whether one's choices had aligned with one's considered values, whether the hours had been inhabited or merely survived. This was the practice by which the abstract commitment to living well became concrete and testable. Seneca describes this practice in his letters with the specificity of someone who has done it regularly rather than merely recommended it. He speaks of questioning himself in the dark after the household has gone quiet, running through the day's moments without the performance that public life requires. The witness in these sessions is the self, demanding in a particular way because it cannot be deceived by the usual instruments of social impression management, and gentle in a different particular way because it is also the one being examined. And punishing the self for imperfection is simply another waste of the time one might otherwise spend improving. The practice is diagnostic, not judicial. Its product is clarity about where the attention went and what the attention going there actually cost. What the full Stoic tradition passed forward to Seneca, and what Seneca passed forward into every subsequent century that read him seriously, was not primarily a set of doctrines about virtue, or cosmology, or logic, though it was all of those things too. It was a way of holding the fact of one's own finitude without either fleeing from it or collapsing under it. The ancient sources record that Zeno, who had arrived in Athens with nothing after a shipwreck, lived to approximately 72 years old and reportedly died by holding his breath, a story that is probably not literally true, but that later admirers found fitting, because it captured something about a man who had throughout his life maintained a particular kind of sovereignty over the only thing he had always owned. His body failed on its own schedule. His mind, they said, remained his. What the Stoic account of time adds to the general counsel about living well is the specific argument about irreversibility. This is not obvious from the outside, but it is central to the philosophy's actual structure. The past cannot be altered. The hours already spent are permanently in whatever condition they were spent. This is a fact that produces, in people who have not thought about it carefully, a kind of vertigo. All those hours gone, irrecoverable, spent in ways one might now assess differently. But the Stoic response to this vertigo is neither to dismiss it nor to drown in it. The response is to notice that the past's irreversibility is also the source of its security. An hour genuinely inhabited cannot be retroactively emptied. A friendship genuinely tended cannot be undone by subsequent fortune. The care brought to a piece of work, the honesty brought to a difficult conversation, the full attention brought to a moment of beauty or difficulty or thought, these exist permanently in the structure of what has actually happened. This is not the same as saying that the past can be replayed, or that memory is fully reliable, or that the subjective sense of having lived well is equivalent to having done so. The Stoics were not naive about the limitations of self-assessment. The evening review exists precisely because honest examination of one's hours reveals fairly regularly that the gap between one's stated values and one's actual behavior is wider than pride would prefer to acknowledge. The point is not that the examined life is effortlessly successful. The point is that it is examined, that it operates with honest knowledge of itself, and therefore has the possibility of genuine correction, and therefore is not simply drifting on the current of habit and circumstance in the direction least examined. The afternoon in Rome, when the city moved at its densest and loudest, was the hour in which the contrast between Stoic counsel and Roman public life was most visible. Men in togas moved between the forum and the baths and the law courts and the senate and the houses of their patrons and clients, each obligation creating the next, each hour consumed by the claim of an external demand that felt in the moment like necessity. The Stoics walking among them were not, in general, visibly different. They held offices, made arguments, fulfilled obligations, but they were, in principle, organized differently on the inside, moving through the same world without being organized by it, treating their hours as their own, even when they were technically occupied by public duties, maintaining in the interior life a sovereignty that the exterior life could pressure but could not dissolve. The idea that Chrysippus and his predecessors had worked out in Athens, that the medium of genuine living is the quality of attention brought to each moment rather than the accumulation of external achievements across time, found in Roman Stoicism its most practical elaboration, not in the form of rules about how to spend one's hours, but in the form of a kind of inner orientation that could be brought to any activity, in any circumstance, however constrained. This is the feature of the Stoic account of time that makes it, 23 centuries after Zeno walked away from his shipwreck, still available to anyone who sits quietly and tries to hold it honestly. The school that bore the name of a covered porch outlasted every political structure of its era. The agora where Zeno taught became first a provincial backwater and then an archaeological site. The painted stoa itself was damaged and rebuilt, and eventually ceased to function as a gathering place. But the ideas that had been spoken aloud there, in the open air, to whoever happened to be walking past, had by that point been written down, copied, discussed, translated, and transmitted to every subsequent culture that found itself asking the same questions about virtue and time and the proper organization of a finite life. Seneca read these ideas in a Rome that their originators could not have imagined. He translated them into a Latin that was both more rhetorically sophisticated and more personally urgent than the philosophical prose of his Greek sources. He addressed them to specific people: Paulinus, buried in the administrative demands of the grain supply; Lucilius, a provincial official working through his middle years with the nagging sense that something had been postponed too long. The philosophy, in his hands, became intimate without losing its rigor. It became human without losing its clarity. The thread running back to Zeno's porch remained visible, but it had been woven into a texture that spoke directly to the specific shape of a life that felt, as lives tend to feel, simultaneously too busy and too short. The structure Chrysippus had built, past, present, future, each making its proper claim on a rational person, arrived in Seneca's work as something warmer than architecture. The past well lived as treasury, the future open and unknown as the ground of neither hope nor dread, but of simple, reasonable provision. The present moment, this breath, and this thought, and this awareness, as the only ground on which anything that genuinely counts as living is actually available. Not the river rushing past on either side, not the landscape seen from the moving vessel of time's passage, but this foothold, this instant, this precise and unrepeatable point of contact between a person and the world they are, briefly and fully, part of. The painted porch is long gone. The agora where it stood has been excavated, its layers separated and dated and labeled. The commerce and argument that once filled it are visible only in what the ground preserved, but the ideas that moved through that open space, spoken to whoever would stop and listen, are not in the ground. They are in the air of any room where someone sits quietly and honestly with the question of what their hours are actually for and what it would mean to hold them with the care the question deserves. The school named for a porch did not need walls to survive. It needed only the repeated willingness of particular people in particular moments to stop and think, to set down whatever they were carrying long enough to ask, with genuine seriousness, whether the carrying had been the best use of what they had. The present moment holds this, not as a concept to be grasped, but as a condition that was already true before the thought of it arrived. The ground underfoot is exactly as solid as it always was. The breath that is happening now has its own completeness. Whatever was genuinely attended to today exists in that permanent condition the past holds, done, real, one's own. The questions that Zeno first turned over in his mind on the Athenian shore, walking away from the wreck of his original itinerary, are still in the air, still patient, still requiring nothing more than the willingness to stand still for a moment and feel the weight of what one is actually carrying, and ask whether one chose to pick it up, or whether it simply accumulated in the hands while the attention was elsewhere. The stillness available in this moment is not an achievement. It requires no preparation, no prior study, no correct understanding of Chrysippus's logical architecture or Seneca's rhetorical strategies. It is the ground that was always here, underfoot, waiting for the day's motion to pause long enough that it could be felt. The Stoics spoke of it in many ways across the centuries of their school's life, but always toward the same place, toward this, whatever this is, in the room where one currently is, in the breath that is currently happening, on the solid quiet ground of the only moment that is actually fully one's own. Seneca walks into the forum at midday. The sun is high and the stone is white with it. Around him the noise is continuous and specific, the call of vendors, the clatter of sandals on travertine, the low negotiating murmur of men conducting the business of an empire. Taugus moved through the crowd in every direction, each one carrying a man who is late for something, or recently arrived from something, or hurrying between the two. The Forum at midday is perhaps the busiest stretch of ground in the known world, and Seneca, who has spent years moving through it, has learned to stand still in the middle of its motion and watch. What he watches is not the commerce, not the legal proceedings happening beneath the basilica's shadow, not the priests emerging from the temple steps with their careful measured walk. What Seneca watches is the quality of attention each person brings to the hour they are standing inside. He has been watching this for years. He has been watching it in dining rooms and in antechambers, in the long corridors of the Palatine Hill where officials wait to be received, in the harbor at Ostia where ships arrive loaded with grain and leave carrying everything Rome's appetite requires. The philosophical inquiry he is conducting is not abstract. It concerns actual people moving through actual hours, and it concerns what those hours contain when they are closely examined, and what they reveal when they are not. He is not judging. That is the first thing to understand about how Seneca stands in the Forum and watches. The figures he sees are not cautionary specimens collected for a moralist's display. They are people he recognizes, people whose patterns he has inhabited himself, people whose errors are continuous with his own. The portraits he is about to draw are not portraits of strangers. There is a senator he knows by name making his way toward the Curia. The man has been in public life for 31 years. He entered it at 22, young and clear-eyed, burning with the conviction that distinction in public service was the highest thing a Roman could achieve. And in this conviction he was not wrong. Exactly, Rome believed it too, and the Stoic tradition had made a principled argument for civic engagement as a form of virtue in practice. He sought his first appointment with genuine purpose. He sought the next one with something slightly more habituated, though still recognizable as purpose. And each subsequent office arrived and was occupied and became the platform from which the next one was pursued, until the seeking itself became the substance of his life, and the offices themselves became stages to be passed through on the way to the one that would finally justify the passage. This senator is at last approaching what he wanted. The consulship is within reach, a matter now of months rather than years, the political arithmetic having finally resolved in his favor after a decade of careful positioning, quiet alliance-making, and the patient accumulation of precisely the right obligations in precisely the right men. He should feel triumphant. He feels, instead, something he has no language for, a thin and persistent note beneath all the preparation, beneath the appointments kept, and the speeches delivered, and the dinners attended with the right level of cheerful engagement. He cannot name the feeling, because he spent the years in which naming feelings is learned in the pursuit of an external thing that promised to make all feelings unnecessary. Seneca watches this man walk. The walk is purposeful. The face is composed. Nothing visible would suggest that anything is wrong, and by every measure Rome maintains, nothing is. He has done precisely what Rome asked him to do. The miser's house is on the Aventine Hill, and it is full. The storerooms hold oil and grain and salted fish and the particular variety of dried figs he cannot stop acquiring, because one winter, long ago, there was a shortage of them, and the fear of that shortage never left him even after the figs returned. The cellars hold wine, more than he will drink in his remaining years, even if he begins drinking with a generosity he has never once managed to feel. The strong boxes hold coin enough to sustain his household for several lifetimes of the kind of living he actually conducts, which is modest, cautious, and arranged entirely around the project of sustaining it. His accounts are reviewed each morning before he allows himself to eat. The ledgers are precise and regularly verified. The steward who manages his estate is watched, and the man who watches the steward is himself watched by a system of small cross-checking accountabilities that the miser assembled over many years with the care of someone constructing a proof. He is not comfortable. This is what Seneca finds philosophically significant. The man has arranged every material condition for comfort and has thereby generated for himself a permanent state of vigilant discomfort, because what he has is always the thing that could be lost, and what he is protecting is always the thing that could be diminished, and the entire effort of his life is directed not toward the enjoyment of what he has accumulated, but toward the endless maintenance of the conditions under which enjoyment might theoretically become possible. Seneca sits with this figure the way a physician sits with a patient whose symptoms point toward a pattern. The diagnosis is clear enough. The miser has confused the preparation for life with life itself, and having made this confusion early enough and consistently enough, the preparation has become the whole of his experience. He is living entirely in a feared future, a future of scarcity and loss that may never arrive, and in the meantime the actual present, warm, provisioned, genuinely secure in every material sense, passes through his hands like grain through a sieve, touching him for a moment, and then gone. The feared morning that he is preparing against will probably not come, and the only morning he knows with certainty he will have is the one he is currently spending with his ledger. There is a man Seneca knows, or has known in several versions under several names, who moves through Rome's pleasures with the dedicated restlessness of someone completing an itinerary. He wakes and goes to the baths, where the water is hot and scented, and where the conversation is brilliant and easy, and he stays long enough to feel that he has been there before the pleasure has quite resolved, already thinking about the morning's entertainment that follows. The entertainment is good, the comedian is sharp, the crowd responsive, the whole experience sharpened by the company of people who know how to enjoy things. He enjoys it provisionally, while mentally positioning himself in relation to the afternoon's banquet. The banquet is lavish and the wine is from Campania, and the guests are the most interesting people available, and he moves through the courses attending to each one with a portion of his attention while holding back something essential, something that cannot quite commit to the present pleasure, because the next pleasure is already visible on the horizon. By evening he reaches the spectacle, and the spectacle is extraordinary, and he sits through it in the mild anesthetic of accumulated stimulation, aware that something magnificent is happening in front of him and unable to feel it fully, the way a person who has eaten all afternoon cannot taste the evening's most carefully prepared dish. He arrives at his bed more tired than when he woke. This is reliable. This happens every day. A tiredness is not the productive tiredness of someone who has given themselves fully to something and spent themselves in it. It is the particular exhaustion of someone who has held themselves slightly back from everything all day and has been worn down not by genuine engagement, but by the continuous friction of proximity to experience without immersion in it. Seneca knows this tiredness. He is describing from the inside, not from a distance. The hedonist's error is not the pursuit of pleasure. The Stoics were not in principle opposed to pleasure, though they located it properly as a preferred indifferent rather than a genuine good. The error is the failure to be fully present for whatever is actually happening. Pleasure pursued by half attention is not pleasure. It is the shape of pleasure, drained of its substance, and what is drained alongside it every day is time. There is a woman, and here Seneca's thinking reaches toward a figure whose pattern he has watched in many forms, who has organized her life around the principle of later. She is not lazy. That is important. Laziness does not require this kind of philosophical attention, because laziness is simply the absence of effort, and its remedy is straightforward. This woman works. She is diligent, thorough, professional, exacting. She takes her obligations seriously in a way that the careless person cannot, and she meets them. She meets them every day. She keeps the grain supply moving, or she manages her household's accounts, or she oversees the education of children for whom she has accepted responsibility, or she conducts the legal and administrative affairs that constitute the practical substance of Roman civic life. She does all of this reliably and with genuine competence. What she has not yet done is begin her actual life. Her actual life, the life she intends to inhabit fully, the life in which she will think the thoughts she has been postponing, read the philosophy she bought and set on the shelf 3 years ago, walk in the gardens of the Pincio in the early morning without a list of things that need attention, spend a full afternoon with the people she loves most, without the half presents she currently offers them. Her actual life is waiting for a specific set of conditions to arrive. One more season of the work she is currently completing, one more year of the position she currently holds. The children a little older, the debt a little smaller, the situation a little more resolved. After the next transition, after things settle, after the horizon retreats at exactly the speed she approaches it. This is the structural feature of the pattern that Seneca notices with the most philosophical precision. It is not accidental. The deferral is not caused by the specific circumstances she is waiting for to resolve. If those circumstances resolve tomorrow, others would arrive to take their place, because the orientation of deferral, the habit of treating the present as preparation for a future in which living will actually begin, is itself the pattern, and the pattern does not end when its current justification is removed. It simply finds a new one. Somewhere, on the shelf, the philosophy book remains unread. Sometime in the next year, she will mean to get to it. The sentence she would have found in it, the one that applies most directly to the structure of her life, has been waiting there for her since she bought it. Seneca knows which sentence he would want her to find. The social climber wakes before the city and begins adjusting. By the time the lamp is lit, his calculations are already running. Which appointments matter most today? Which patron's favor requires cultivation? Which rival's advancement must be watched and accounted for in the geometry of his own position? He thinks about this the way a nautical person thinks about wind and current. With attention so practiced, it no longer feels like attention, just the continuous background calculation of a man moving through a social sea that will carry him forward if he reads it correctly and push him back if he misreads it for even a day. His time is exquisitely organized around other people's opinions of him. This organization is not incidental. It is the infrastructure of his life. He adjusts his morning schedule to accommodate the preference of someone whose esteem he requires, and in doing so, he rearranges the hours in ways that would never be sanctioned by his own considered preferences, because his own considered preferences are not the organizing principle. External judgment is the organizing principle, and external judgment is a horizon that shifts constantly and cannot be satisfied, because each advance in status generates a new cohort of people whose opinions now matter in ways the previous cohorts did not, and the machinery of calibration must continuously expand to encompass them. He is very good at this. His social intelligence is real. He reads the room with an accuracy that constitutes a genuine skill, and he deploys it with the consistency of someone who has made a deep investment and intends to protect it. The investment is his hours. He has paid for his current position, and it is a good position, envied by many, acknowledged by most, with years of exactly this calibrated self-arrangement, years of allowing his time to be organized by the preferences and judgments of people who have never thought of his time as belonging to him in the first place, because why would they? Seneca writes the word in the margin of his thinking, occupata, the occupied ones, and he pauses because the word does not describe a type of person he has observed from across a clean philosophical distance. He is writing from the middle of the same life he is describing. He has sat in the antechambers. He has arranged his mornings around imperial preference. He has guarded his position in the court of Nero with exactly the kind of political attentiveness that the social climber deploys in the houses of the powerful. The candor required to hold this fact steadily, to write about the occupied life with full philosophical authority, without exempting himself from its operations, is what separates the writing from sermon and makes it philosophy instead. A philosopher who has never been tempted by the errors he describes has very little to say about why those errors are so persistent, so easy, so structurally embedded in the way a life constructs itself hour by hour. The occupation of the occupati is not a moral failure visible only from outside. It is the natural shape that time takes when it is not actively, deliberately, and philosophically reclaimed. The senator walks home from the curia at dusk on the day of his investiture. He has been consul for 7 hours. The ceremony was precisely as he had imagined it, which means it was both real and already fading, the way the ceremony of every long-anticipated thing begins its retreat into the past almost before it has finished occurring in the present. There were speeches, there was applause, there was the particular quality of regard in the eyes of people who now have to recalibrate their relationship to him, which he had imagined would feel like triumph, and which feels, in fact, like administration. He is already responsible for things. The position, which he spent 3 decades reaching, is already generating its own obligations, its own subordinates' requests, its own correspondence. He passes through the forum on his way home. The market stalls are closing. The afternoon's crowds have dispersed into the insulae and houses of the 7 hills. A handful of philosophers are still talking beneath the Basilica Aemilia, a small circle of men who have been there most of the afternoon, their conversation generating exactly nothing in the way of civic result. The consul glances at them with the mild tolerance of a successful man for activities he has never needed to take seriously. He does not pause. What he does not know, and what Seneca is quietly thinking about on the same walk home through the same emptying forum, is that the 3 decades this man spent reaching his position might have been spent inhabiting his hours in ways that would, by now, have constituted a kind of life that the consulship cannot provide. Not a better life, necessarily. Seneca is not making a simple argument for contemplation over action. The Stoic tradition thought highly of public service and had principled reasons for it. What Seneca is examining is the difference between genuine engagement with one's hours and the systematic deferral of genuine engagement in favor of the machinery of achievement. And the consul, who is a good man and a capable one, has confused the machinery for the thing itself in a way that will be very difficult to see from inside the machinery. The 3 philosophers still talking beneath the colonnade are arguing about time, not about how to manage it, not about its scarcity, but about its nature, whether the past is genuinely gone or whether it is in some sense preserved in the fact of having occurred. whether a single hour inhabited with full attention might contain more genuine life than a decade of hours inhabited partially. One of them is making a distinction that Seneca, passing 30 feet away, would recognize immediately. The other two are pushing back with the specific pleasure of people who do not want the argument to end because they are living inside it, and the living inside it is itself the point. The consul's litter passes. The conversation continues. Return to the miser for a moment, because there is something Seneca wants to look at more carefully. The miser relationship to his possessions is one of perpetual anticipated loss. Everything he owns is something he might lose, and the consciousness of this possibility organizes his experience of ownership in a way that eliminates most of the enjoyment ownership might otherwise provide. He checks the oil jars not because he expects them to be depleted, but because the checking is the act that temporarily quiets the anxiety their potential depletion generates. The checking does not resolve the anxiety. Nothing resolves the anxiety because the anxiety is not responding to an actual shortage. It is responding to the structure of his relationship to the future, which is a relationship of chronic dread. What Seneca notices is that this dread is itself a form of impoverishment. The miser has less access to his actual life than a man of genuinely modest means who does not organize his consciousness around anticipated scarcity. The oil is there, the figs are there, the cellars are full, and the ledgers are balanced, and the feared morning is at this moment not happening. The present is abundant, but the present is not where the miser lives. He lives in the future, and the future he inhabits is a future of absence, and in that absence he has spent years of hours that belonged, had he been able to use them, to a present that was genuinely sufficient. Seneca writes, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a great deal of it. And the waste is not laziness. The waste is consciousness directed toward what is not present, toward what has not yet arrived, toward what may never come, while the thing that is actually present, the hour that is actually available, passes through without being touched. The hedonist at the evening spectacle, half absent from the thing he paid for and arranged his day to attend. The senator in his moment of formal triumph, already somewhere else in his own attention. The miser at his ledger in the full house. The woman whose philosophy book is still waiting. The social climber whose mourning belongs to someone else's judgment. None of them has done anything dramatically wrong. None of them has committed the kind of moral failure that Roman society would name as failure. They are, by every available external measure, living correctly. The work is getting done, the positions are being filled, the social fabric is being maintained. What is being missed, quietly, systematically, without any single moment of obvious collapse, is the interior substance of each particular hour. The thing that would make these hours genuinely lived rather than merely occupied. There is a word Seneca reaches for and then sets down because it risks sounding like condemnation when it is intended as description. The word is somnambulism, the condition of moving through the world without full wakefulness, accomplishing the external requirements of the day while the internal life sleeps. He does not use the word because it carries the weight of judgment, and judgment is not what the portraits require. What they require is recognition, which is a different operation. Recognition asks the observer to see something that was already true, already present in the structure of the day, and simply had not been looked at directly. Outside Seneca's window, Rome continues. The forum empties toward evening and fills again at dawn. The grain arrives from Egypt and is distributed through mechanisms of such organizational complexity that they constitute one of the great achievements of Roman administration. Children are born and named and taught to read. People fall in love and conduct their love affairs with varying degrees of success and self-awareness. Old men sit in the gardens near the Tiber and watch the water with the particular stillness of people who have learned, at last, that stillness is not wasted time. Most people are somewhere in the middle of their most important question and do not know it. This is not a criticism. It is the condition of being alive in the middle of a life, which is the only position in which a life can be lived. The question of how to inhabit one's hours is not a question with a fixed answer arrived at once and then settled. It is a question that has to be returned to, and the returning is itself part of what inhabiting an hour means. Seneca knows this because he has watched himself fail at it. He has spent mornings in exactly the pattern he is describing. He has deferred. He has allowed other people's urgencies to fill his hours with their content. He has attended a spectacle he barely saw. He has conducted accounts against a future that never arrived in the form he feared. The philosophical argument he is making is not an argument from a position of mastery. It is an argument from a position of hard-won, repeatedly tested, incompletely achieved understanding of what it costs to lose an hour and what it means to keep one. Now return to the forum one more time at the particular hour before the afternoon heat breaks and the crowds begin to thin. There is a man standing still. He is not waiting for anyone. He is not composing a response to an earlier conversation or planning a future one. He is simply standing in the Forum Romanum, the center of the world's most powerful empire, at the most productive hour of his working day. And he is present in the moment with a completeness that is unusual enough that a few people passing him have glanced twice, trying to identify the quality of his stillness. He looks, one of them thinks, like someone who has just set something down. He has not arrived at this stillness by accident or by temperament. He arrived at it by working through, slowly and honestly, the exact question Seneca is working through in his essay. What is an hour for? What constitutes genuine living as opposed to its performance? What it would mean to reach the end of the afternoon, knowing that the afternoon had actually occurred, rather than simply elapsed. The working through took years and is not complete. It will not be complete. But it has produced this: a capacity for occasional full presence in the middle of the day's demands, a brief interval of actual inhabitation of the actual moment, which the Stoic tradition does not promise will last, but does insist is possible, and does maintain that each time it occurs, it constitutes something real that cannot be taken away. He will go back to work in a few minutes. The afternoon's obligations are genuine and will not wait indefinitely. He knows this. He is not a man who has escaped the demands of Roman public life, or who wishes to the Stoic tradition made a principled case for engagement, and he is engaged. What he has found is not a way out of his hours, but a way more fully into them, which is a different discovery and a harder one, because it does not require any change in external circumstance. Seneca watches him from a distance and returns, eventually, to thinking about Paulinus. Paulinus, the grain prefect, to whom the essay is addressed, is a specific person with a specific problem. The problem is not that his work is unimportant. The grain supply of Rome is emphatically important, and a man who manages it competently is performing a genuine service. The problem is not that public life is empty. The problem is what Paulinus's relationship to his own hours has become over years of serving the hours of a city, a relationship in which the city's appetite has gradually colonized the space in which his own genuine life might otherwise have been conducting itself. Seneca is not asking him to resign, he is asking him to look. The portrait Seneca has been assembling across the essay, the ambitious man, the miser, the restless hedonist, the woman of permanent deferral, the social performer, is in each case a portrait of a specific relationship between a person and their own time. What unifies the portraits is not the type of error, but the quality of unawareness. Each figure moves through their hours in a pattern whose consequences they have not yet examined, because examination requires exactly the kind of stillness that the pattern prevents. The occupatee are busy in ways that prevent them from noticing how they are being occupied. The busyness is, in each case, the mechanism of its own perpetuation. The philosophical intervention is not instruction, it is interruption. If the argument can pause the senator's walk for a moment, if it can lead the miser to set down the ledger for an afternoon and simply sit in the storeroom that is full, if it can accompany the hedonist through one evening at the spectacle with the volume of internal commentary turned down and the performance allowed to actually arrive, if it can sit beside the woman at her desk and suggest that the philosophy book on the shelf is not waiting for the life to settle, but is itself the beginning of the settling, if it can tell the social climber, without judgment, that the opinions he has organized his hours around cannot in their nature be satisfied, and that the hour now available to him belongs to no one's judgment but his own. The interruption is brief. It asks nothing permanent. It makes no demands on the future and criticizes nothing about the past. It asks only that this moment, the one currently available, be noticed. Seneca folds his hands on the desk. The afternoon is turning. The noise of the forum has shifted in its quality as the shadows grow longer, the high urgent pitch of midday business softening toward something less pressured, the city's attention beginning, almost imperceptibly, to move toward evening. The portraits he has been drawing are not finished. No portrait of this kind is ever finished, because the figures it depicts are alive and still making choices, still in the middle of the pattern, still capable of the pause that might interrupt the pattern and lead somewhere different. The senator has not yet had his morning of genuine quietude. The miser has not yet set the ledger aside and sat in the fullness of his house. The woman with the philosophy book has not yet reached for it. They are all still early in their story. What Seneca is offering is not judgment of how those stories have gone so far. What he is offering is a different way of reading the remaining hours, a reading practice rather than a prescription, an invitation to look at the specific texture of one's own days with the philosophical patience required to see what is actually there. The afternoon light falls at its long evening angle across the travertine of the forum. The crowd has thinned. The vendors are stacking their goods. The last petitioners are leaving the Basilica Aemilia with the day's resolution or its deferral, and the distinction between resolution and deferral will have diminishing visibility to both parties as the evening proceeds and the particular quality of the late hour settles over everything with its familiar democratic softness. There are still 3 philosophers talking beneath the colonnade, though the group has grown to 5. The argument has moved, by the natural drift of sustained conversation, from the nature of time to the question of what constitutes a genuine human life, as opposed to its approximate, and then from there to something quieter, harder to formulate, having to do with the specific quality of presence that distinguishes one kind of inhabiting an hour from another. They are talking about something real. Their conversation is generating nothing in the way of administrative result, nothing that will appear in the grain prefect's ledger, or the consul's correspondence, or the social climber's calculation of tomorrow's appointments. It is producing only the thing it is, a genuine engagement between minds, with a question that matters, in the specific warm evening air of a city that is slowly, without noticing, arriving at the end of another day. One of the 5 pauses in the middle of a sentence. He has had a thought that needs space around it before it becomes words. The others wait. They are not impatient. This is the quality of their attention, that they can allow a pause to be a pause rather than a vacancy, requiring immediate filling, and in the pause the evening presses in a little. The softened noise of the city settling, the lengthening shadow of the colonnade across the stone, the smell of the day's heat releasing itself from the travertine in a slow exhalation. He finishes the sentence. The conversation continues. This is perhaps what Seneca keeps returning to, the thing beneath the argument about time's proper use, the thing the portraits are all gesturing toward from the outside. Not the question of how much time one has, which is beyond choosing, and not the question of how one fills that time, which is answerable in too many ways. Something quieter. The question of whether a person is actually present for the hours they are passing through, whether the life they are living is being lived by them or being conducted at a slight remove, whether the interval between one breath and the next is inhabited or elapsed. The philosopher who paused has a look on his face that Seneca, watching from across the forum, recognizes. It is the look of a person who is fully in the moment they are standing inside, not performing that presence, not working to achieve it or maintain it or signal it to the people around him. Simply there, in the conversation, in the evening, in the specific October light of a forum at the end of a day in Rome, alive to what is actually present rather than reaching for what is elsewhere. It lasts for a moment. It is enough. Seneca turns and walks home. He is thinking about Paulinus. He is thinking about the essay he has been writing, the portraits he has assembled, the argument he has been making in the plain Latin he has found is the most honest instrument available to him. He is thinking about the drawer in Paulinus's office, where the letter might sit unopened while the grain supply requires attention, and about the fact that the grain supply genuinely does require attention, and about the fact that these two things, the importance of the grain supply and the importance of looking at one's own hours, are not in the kind of opposition that would require a person to choose between them. They require only a different quality of presence in the hours that are already there, already passing, already the substance of the only life available. The essay will find Paulinus eventually. It will arrive in the drawer, and Paulinus will have a morning, some morning, in which he will set aside the morning's first requisition and pick it up and read the opening sentence. And the opening sentence will name something he has not yet found, the language for, but has felt, in the way that arguments about genuine things are felt before they are understood, as a pressure or an absence or a quality of tiredness that does not resolve with rest. He might set the essay down before he finishes it. The morning's pressures will genuinely require him. The grain does not wait on the philosophy, but he will pick it up again. Seneca knows this because he knows Paulinus, and because anyone who has felt the thing the essay is pointing at, the slight continuous loss of an hour that is occupied rather than inhabited, the thin persistent note beneath the day's achievement that has no name yet, will return to whatever seems to be describing that feeling, the way a person returns in the night to a thought that almost cohered but dissolved before it completed itself. The evening is coming on. The forum is nearly empty. The lamplighter is making his round through the district's colonnades, and small points of light are beginning to appear in the insuli's upper windows, and the smell of cooking is rising from the streets below the Aventine and the Caelian and the Esquiline in their separate registers, olive oil and garlic, and the particular fragrance of bread that has been in the oven since the afternoon and is now, in the evening's first real coolness, ready. Somewhere in that city, a person is pausing before they open their front door. The day is behind them, complete in the way all days eventually become complete, resolved into the past where it will remain. What is ahead of them is the evening's first quiet, the transition from the day's obligations into the hours that are most fully their own. They are standing on the threshold, neither in the house nor in the street, in the specific brief interval of an arrival that has not quite happened yet. They are standing in exactly the moment Seneca has been writing about, not a senator, perhaps, or a miser, or a restless hedonist moving through pleasures without quite landing in any of them. Perhaps none of those things. Perhaps just a person at the end of an ordinary day, standing at the door of an ordinary house, in the last of the light, with the evening fully available in front of them, and the question, quiet, unhurried, asking nothing urgent, of what it would mean to walk through that door and be fully present for whatever happens next. The question does not need an answer tonight. It only needs to be recognized as a question, which is the beginning of the only kind of philosophy that matters, not the philosophy conducted in the forum's colonnade by dedicated practitioners, but the philosophy of a person at their own threshold, in the last warm light of the day, noticing that the hour before them is genuinely and completely theirs. Seneca extinguishes his lamp. The flame draws down to almost nothing, holds for a moment at the wick, and then the room is dark. Not entirely dark, the city outside still carries its faint glow, the pale geometry of Rome at night, pressing softly through the shutters, but dark enough that he can no longer see the scroll on the table before him, dark enough that the work of the day has officially finally ended. He lies back, and then, in his letters to Lucilius, he tells us what happens next. He reviews the day, not with urgency, not with self-reproach as the first instrument he reaches for. He reviews it the way a man surveys a field at evening, walking the edges of what was planted, noting with quiet attention what grew and what did not, what the soil held and what it released. The hours pass through him, one at a time, each one offered briefly to the lampless air of his private room, and then released into the only place they can now go, the completed past, which Seneca considers, in a way that takes some settling before it reveals its comfort, the most secure territory a human being can occupy. He wrote to Lucilius, "Review your day before sleep. Ask it 3 things. Where did the day fail? Where did it resist failure? Where could it have done better?" The questions are plain, almost domestic in their tone. They carry none of the grandeur one might expect from a philosopher so closely braided with the imperial household, none of the rhetorical ambition that characterized his public work. They are the questions of someone alone in a room, accountable to no audience, performing nothing for nobody, simply and quietly taking stock of the hours just past. This is where philosophy, for Seneca, closes its loop. An argument can be beautifully constructed. A sentence can hold its meaning through 2,000 years. A treatise can travel from a Roman study to a Corsican exile to every subsequent century that has found itself reading Latin in the long afternoons of a life that will not go on forever. But none of that counts for what happens in the dark, in the quiet, when the lamp has been set down and the day is over. What counts is the honest accounting. What counts is whether the hours, those particular, irreplaceable, unrepeatable hours, were genuinely met. Seneca had been a man of enormous words and complicated circumstances. He had served in the court of an emperor and navigated the particular unreality that attaches to power at that proximity. He had accumulated wealth that sat awkwardly beside his counsel about the emptiness of wealth. He had written with tremendous clarity about the dangers of the life perpetually deferred while his own life remained, for long stretches, genuinely constrained by forces not entirely his to direct. None of this disqualified him from what he was trying to do. He knew it did not disqualify him. What it gave him instead was the specific honesty of someone who has tested these arguments against actual difficulty and returned with a report that has mud on it, that has been genuinely used, that is not the pristine offering of a man who sat in comfort and announced what suffering should look like. The evening review, this quiet Stoic habit of looking honestly at the day before releasing it into sleep, is not a punishment. That distinction matters. It is not the inquisition of a harsh internal judge making a record of failures. It arrives instead when practiced with the patience Seneca describes as something closer to a companion, something that sits beside the hours that have just passed and helps name them without drama, without the inflation of error into catastrophe, without the equally false softening of actual lapse into something more comfortable. It sees clearly, and that clarity, the Stoics had long understood, is itself a form of rest, because what exhausts a person is not honest seeing. What exhausts is the energy of avoidance, the constant, subtle, largely unconscious work of not quite looking at the day as it actually was, of moving forward through the hours with the low-level friction of a dozen small evasions. The tired feeling that arrives not from having done too much, but from having been insufficiently present in whatever was done. Seneca had noticed this. He had written about it not as a psychological observation, but as a philosophical one. The fatigue of the occupati was not physical. It ran deeper than the body. It was the fatigue of a self that had been everywhere and nowhere, that had moved through an entire day's worth of appointments and conversations and decisions without ever quite landing in any of them, without ever quite being the one who was there. The evening review, practiced in the dark after the lamp goes down, is the counterweight to that. It is the practice of finally arriving at the day that has already passed, arriving honestly, without defense, without the modifications that the social performance of the day required, and simply being present to what happened. The hours were what they were. They cannot be rearranged now. They have passed into the permanent record of what has actually occurred, and Seneca considers this permanence not as a threat, but as a foundation. What is genuinely past, genuinely lived, cannot be taken. Fortune cannot reach it. The emperor cannot revoke it. The turning of circumstances that has always threatened what lies ahead has no purchase on what lies behind, and if the hours that now lie behind were genuinely inhabited, then they constitute something solid in a life whose other securities are all contingent. This is the argument in its quietest form, stripped of its rhetorical architecture, lying on its back in the dark, as Seneca lies on his back in the dark. Time that has been truly lived becomes the most durable possession available to a human being, not wealth, which fortune takes, not reputation, which opinion revises, not health, which the body surrenders on its own schedule. The hours that were genuinely met, the moments that were actually inhabited, rather than merely passed through, these, once they have occurred, are permanent in the only way anything can be permanent in a world where everything else changes. There is a second movement in the Stoic philosophical tradition that arrives alongside the evening review, and it is older even than Seneca's particular articulation of it. Memento mori. The practice of holding the thought of death in the mind with deliberateness and patience, not as a morbid exercise, but as a clarifying one, a lens brought into focus so that the distant blurriness resolves into legible line. Seneca returns to this practice throughout his letters, not because death is the central subject, but because death is the edge against which all the other subjects acquire their proper definition. Without it, time is merely continuous. With it, each hour becomes something specific, a thing with an edge, a finite thing whose value is inseparable from its finitude. Epictetus, who came after Seneca, and who had lived with a kind of material constraint that Seneca only theorized about. Epictetus, who had been a slave, whose freedom was entirely internal by necessity rather than philosophy, described the proper relationship to impermanence in terms so plain they required no ornamentation. Hold everything, he said, as something received on loan, the cup, the child, the friend, the year. Hold them carefully, with genuine love and attention, knowing all the while that they will be asked back, and that when they are asked back, the right response is to return them without a scene, not without grief. Grief is honest, but without the particular additional suffering that comes from believing the loan was a permanent possession that has been unjustly revoked. Seneca had absorbed this. He had made it his own in a specifically Roman register, more rhetorical than Epictetus, more literary, more conscious of the tradition he was working within and the audience he was working toward. But underneath the rhetoric, the same structural argument was operating. Time is given. Time will be recalled. The question is only what one does with the time between the giving and the recalling. And what one does, Seneca had concluded after long consideration, and at least 8 years of enforced stillness, in which to test the conclusion against actual experience, is this: inhabit it, not plan for it, not manage it from a careful distance, not arrange it into a future that perpetually retreats. Inhabit it, which means bringing the whole of one's attention into the present hour, not as a technique, not as a practice that one performs and then evaluates for its success, but as the simplest and most ordinary form of being oneself in one's own time. Philosophy, for Seneca, was the instrument of this inhabitation, not philosophy as argument, as contest, as the public performance of intellectual rigor. He was dismissive of that version. The philosopher in the forum, demonstrating dialectical agility to an appreciative crowd. Philosophy as a private and continuous practice of learning to see what is actually happening in one's own hours. Philosophy as the technology of genuine presence, the long training in attention that allows a person to move through their days without the specific ghostliness of someone who is always preparing for a life that never quite begins. This is why he read, not to accumulate, not to demonstrate. He writes to Lucilius about the way reading a great mind draws that mind into one's own present. How Zeno, dead 3 centuries before Seneca was born, could arrive in the middle of a Roman afternoon and say something true about how to hold the hours, and the afternoon would be changed by it. How Epicurus, whose school was the nominal competitor of the Stoa, but whose counsel Seneca quotes with frank admiration whenever it is true, could sit at the table of a Stoic's morning and contribute something useful and leave without a quarrel. The philosophical tradition, read this way, is not a library of positions competing for authority. It is a set of companions across time, voices that arrive when needed, that make the particular hour of their arrival slightly longer and slightly less alone. Seneca had written about this, the way genuine reading expands the experienced length of a life. A person who has truly inhabited the thought of Plato has lived a life that includes Plato's thinking from the inside, which is not the same as knowing what Plato thought. It is closer to having spent real time in a real company, the company of a particular mind working through something that genuinely mattered to it. And this time counts. Seneca believed it counted in the fullest sense, not as supplementary decoration to a life, but as part of its actual substance. The hours spent with Plato, genuinely spent rather than merely documented, were hours genuinely lived. This is where the argument becomes, at its most settled, something that can be carried into sleep without remainder. The life that is genuinely lived is not bounded by the biological facts of a single body moving through a single span of years. It extends backward into every genuine contact with a mind that has thought carefully and honestly about the things that matter. It extends outward into every real conversation, every moment of genuine presence with another person, every hour in which one was fully the one who was there. And it extends forward in the same way, not as hope, but as practice, because the practice is available right now, and right now is the only time it has ever been available. Montaigne, in his Tower Library in the Dordogne 15 centuries after Seneca wrote, had Latin editions of the Letters and of De Brevitate Vitae open on the table beside his own manuscripts. The pages were worn soft at the corners from handling. He had read Seneca so many times that the sentences had become part of his own interior voice. When he wrote about time, about the proper use of the hours, about the vanity of deferral, he was in conversation with Seneca, openly, without embarrassment, the way one is in conversation with someone one has known for decades. He wrote Seneca's name often. He quoted him the way one quotes a friend, not to establish authority, but to share what the friend said because it was true. And Montaigne, in his tower, reading Seneca by the light of an afternoon in Perigord, was doing exactly what Seneca had described. He was extending the experienced length of his life by genuinely inhabiting another mind. He was living in 2 centuries simultaneously, his own, with its religious wars and political uncertainty, and the particular textures of a 16th century French afternoon, and Seneca's, with its entirely different political danger and its court of an entirely different kind of emperor. The 2 centuries were not confused. They sat beside each other the way 2 people can sit beside each other without becoming the same person, each recognizably itself, the contact between them making both more vivid. Time in this understanding is not a corridor one moves through toward an end. It is something more like a depth, a quality that can be either present or absent in any given hour, regardless of how long that hour runs on a clock. Hours that are deeply inhabited have more of it. Hours that are evaded have less. And the instruments for deepening any given hour, philosophy, genuine attention, honest self-examination, real contact with other minds, either living or historical, are all available without waiting, without prerequisite, without any special circumstance needing first to be arranged. Seneca had believed this. He had argued it with all the considerable force of his rhetorical gifts. He had, in his personal history, both failed it and returned to it, in the way people return to things they genuinely believe, even when behavior temporarily runs ahead of belief in the wrong direction. The Stoic tradition did not ask for perfection, it asked for orientation, for the ongoing, patient, honest practice of returning one's attention to what one actually values, noticing the gaps between value and action, and using the evening review not to condemn those gaps, but to understand them well enough to close them a little more tomorrow. There is something specifically calming in the Stoic account of what cannot be taken. The morning's appointments, the week's demands, the season's pressures, all of these are contingent. All of these belong to the category of preferred indifference, things that matter in a practical sense, but that cannot, even in their absence, diminish the person who faces their absence with equanimity and genuine presence. What cannot be taken is the quality of mind brought to each hour. What cannot be taken is the genuine inhabitation of the time that has already passed. What cannot be taken is the ongoing practice of returning, with patience and without theater, to the actual present, this breath, this room, this specific moment of quiet, in which nothing further is required. The Stoic philosophers had a name for this moment of genuine presence in one's own life. They called it living in accordance with nature, which sounds, at first hearing, like something vaguely bucolic, something about rivers and trees. What it meant was something more precise and more interior. To live in accordance with nature meant to live as what one actually is, a rational creature with the capacity for genuine attention and honest self-direction, not as what circumstance has temporarily required one to perform, not as the role that the court or the marketplace or the social arrangement of one's era has assigned, but as the thing beneath all of that, the mind that can notice, assess, choose, and return. That mind, Seneca believed, was the one thing that genuinely belonged to the person who had it. Seneca, in his private room in the dark, running through the hours of the day just past, was exercising the only possession he was entirely confident was his. The lamp's wick, extinguished, holds its warmth a little longer than the light. This is not nothing. The heat of the burning persists into the room even after the visible flame has gone, the way a well-used space holds the warmth of what happened in it. The way a thought genuinely followed leaves something in the mind even after the thinking itself has passed into memory. Seneca knew this. He wrote about it without sentimentality, as a plain philosophical observation. The hours that have been genuinely lived do not disappear when they pass. They become part of the permanent record of what one has actually been, and this record, unlike almost everything else in a contingent and changeable world, is entirely secure. This is the counsel that arrives, across 20 centuries of transit, not as doctrine, but as the observation of a man who tested it against actual difficulty and found it, on balance, sound. It is not offered as consolation for the hours that have been lost. Those hours are gone, and Seneca had too much honesty to pretend that loss is neutral. It is offered as orientation, as the practical suggestion that the only response to having allowed hours to drift away without genuine inhabitation is to inhabit the next hour more fully, not dramatically, not with the exaggerated attentiveness of someone who has just been frightened into wakefulness, but simply and quietly, the way one comes home after a long journey and notices the room one has always lived in with slightly fresher attention. Cato the Younger, in the last hours of his life at Utica, read Plato's Phaedo by lamplight before he slept. The political situation was unambiguous. The morning would bring what the morning would bring, and Cato, who had embodied Stoic principles so completely that later writers spoke of him as philosophy made visible, read the Phaedo, carefully, according to the ancient sources, unhurriedly. He read it through once, and then he read it again. What he was doing, in the terms that matter here, was inhabiting those hours fully. He was being entirely present in the only hour that was actually his, that one, the one he was in. And in that inhabitation, there was a form of sovereignty that no external circumstance could revoke, because it was occurring entirely within the jurisdiction of his own attention. The Stoics did not guarantee that this sovereignty would feel triumphant. They did not promise that genuine inhabitation of one's hours would produce a life that looked, from the outside, like a success by any conventional measure. What they promised was more modest, and on reflection, more durable, that a life genuinely inhabited is a life that has actually occurred, that cannot be dismissed or undone, that stands completed in the only register that matters to the person who lived it. not the register of reputation or achievement, or the external marks by which one era judges the worth of a life, the register of genuine experience, the register of hours that were actually met. Seneca, lying in the dark after the lamp goes out, reviewing the hours just passed, is doing something very simple. He is acknowledging that the day happened. He is receiving it honestly without modification as the thing it was. He is releasing each hour into the completed past with the quiet recognition that what was genuinely lived there is now permanently held. And then, having done this, he rests, not because the questions are answered, not because the philosophical arguments have arrived at a final resting point from which no further examination is required. The questions are not answered. Seneca knew this better than anyone. He had spent a lifetime with these questions and had never confused the act of living seriously among them with the act of resolving them. The questions remain open. They will be here tomorrow. They have been here for as long as there have been minds capable of holding them, and they will be here long after the last lamp of the last philosopher has been set down. But the questions, genuinely held and honestly approached, have a quality that becomes apparent only after one has been with them for some time. They do not agitate. A question genuinely open, accepted as genuinely open, received without the urgency of needing it resolved before morning, settles into the mind the way long familiar objects settle into the corners of a room one has lived in for years. They become part of the texture of things. They become the company one keeps rather than the problems one fights. And in this form, as permanent, open, honestly acknowledged companions, they are not disturbing. They are, in their own specific way, a form of rest. The argument about time, the argument that life is not short, but that we make it short, that the hours surrendered without genuine inhabitation are the only genuine poverty available to a person who still has hours to spend. This argument does not conclude with a list of instructions. It concludes with an invitation, or it does not even conclude, because an argument this structural, this woven into the fabric of what it means to live as a thinking creature in time, does not have a natural ending point. It simply continues to be available. It is available now in this room, in this quiet, in whatever is happening in the mind that has been accompanying it through the evening. It asks nothing immediate. It points toward no action required before sleep. It is simply here, patient as the question it rises from, asking only to be carried forward into the next hour with a little more genuine attention than the hour before. What Seneca gave Paulinus in the essay that carries his name across 20 centuries of reading was not a solution. He was explicit about this in his most honest moments. He gave him a reorientation, a gentle and serious argument that the thing Paulinus had been spending his life managing, the grain supply of Rome, the administrative machinery of an empire, the endless stream of requisitions and ledgers and petitioners, was not, had never been, the substance of a life. That beneath all of it, waiting with the patience of something that does not require acknowledgement to continue existing, was the actual life, the hours, the possibility of genuine inhabitation, the practice available at any moment of returning to what is actually here. The lamp in Seneca's room has been out for some time now. The city outside the shutters has grown quieter. The temperature of the room has fallen by a degree or two, and Seneca lies in the dark with the day's hours released, one by one, into the permanent record of things that have actually occurred, and the philosophical questions that have occupied him all his life lie open in the room around him, like furniture, familiar, solid, not demanding, simply present in the way things are present in a room where someone has lived with them long enough to stop needing them to be anything other than what they are. The questions are still here. They will be here in the morning. They will be here when the lamp is relit and the scroll is unrolled and the next sentence begins to find its way from the reed to the papyrus. They have been here since before Seneca was born, and they were here when Zeno paced under the painted porch, and they were here when Socrates asked what justice was in the last years of a life he was not afraid to complete. They do not age. They do not require tending. They simply remain open and patient in the long night of a tradition that has never stopped being alive to anyone willing to sit quietly enough to hear it. Whatever was genuinely lived today, the hours that were actually inhabited, the moments of real attention, the conversations that were truly had, the minutes of honest self-examination, the thoughts that were followed with genuine care rather than useful efficiency, all of this is now permanently held. It cannot be revised. It cannot be lost to the morning's next demand or the season's next arrangement. It has occurred. It is real in the way only completed things are real.